Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We also need to talk about what's going on in the Middle East, as Israel has just said it hit Hezbollah's main headquarters in southern Beirut. The Israeli Defense Forces on X saying that the IDF conducted what it's calling a precise strike on the central headquarters of the Hezbollah terrorist organization, embedded under residential buildings in the heart of a part of Beirut. This, of course, is coming after we heard from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly in New York earlier today, saying Israel has no choice but to keep fighting.
As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, Israel has no choice, and Israel has every right to remove this threat and return our citizens to their homes safely. And that's exactly what we're doing.
If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that he was addressing a room that was more empty than it was full. We want to get the latest now on this conflict and turn to an expert on armed conflict. Kailey Grieco, the senior fellow with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy, is with us here on Balance of Power. Kailey, it's always great to have you. So I guess my first question is, we have been seeing Israel conducting these strikes for well over a week now. 700 people, according to Lebanese authorities, have been killed, including some 50 children. And now they hit Hezbollah's main headquarters. Is this not something they should have done first?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's quite an escalation, I would say. I think that's probably why it was not struck first. Both sides, Hezbollah and Israel, have been trying to take actions, increasingly gradual escalatory actions, but trying to keep it below the threshold that will result in a full-out war. And as they're proceeding up this sort of escalation ladder, they're getting closer and closer to that. And I think that that's what this strike is meant to signal, is that Israel is willing to escalate further.
Well, so if Israel is willing, it becomes a question of how Hezbollah meets that escalation, if it has the desire to do that as well. What kind of response would you expect from this Iranian proxy when its headquarters were hit and it is escalatory in your view?
Yes, I mean, I think the challenge here is that there are no good options for Israel right now, and there are no good options for Hezbollah. We see a lot of signs that Hezbollah does not want an all-out war. It doesn't really serve its group's interests. And so it's been trying to respond in some way to reestablish deterrence with Israel. So trying to respond to these tit-for-tat moves, but again, without triggering a larger response from Israel. But if it tries to, at this point, back down, it's at risk of losing some kind of face, right? It's spent years trying to build up this deterrence against Israel. And so backing down is really hard for it because there's going to be concerns that it looks weak. And that's really the last thing that it wants. But at the same time, it's losing some of the support of the local population. And so it's really boxed in its choices. And I think they're going to be trying once again to thread this very thin needle of responding in a forceful way without triggering an all-out war. But this is a very dangerous dance, and each round it's getting more and more dangerous.
Well, I wonder, Kailey, if this really is about what Hezbollah wants, or at the end of the day, if it's about what Iran wants of Hezbollah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great question. One of the things that I think is sort of ironic is that I think Iran and the United States find themselves in similar positions right now in terms of the Middle East, and that Iran does not seem to want an all-out war. The United States does not want an all-out war. But we're also both trying to support our local partners. We're trying to support Israel. They're trying to support Hezbollah, which is a really important proxy actor for them. And so trying to almost restrain our partners so that we don't end up in this all-out war, but while still being seen as supporting that local partner ally. And so there is a role here, though, for Iran to step in and to try to restrain Hezbollah and try to get them to back away from the brink. And I think that's actually going to be critical in helping to calm things down.
I just want to quickly mention some breaking news as we've been monitoring the New York courthouse in which New York City Mayor Eric Adams, after yesterday being indicted on federal fraud and bribery charges, is being arraigned. He has pleaded not guilty to those federal charges. Of course, he was facing 5 charges in total. That is the latest as expected. He has entered a not guilty plea, and we'll continue to keep you updated on that story, especially if we hear from him outside of the courthouse. Kelly, I'd like to move on to a different conflict, because also in New York today, we saw a meeting take place between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump. It, of course, comes after Zelensky met with Biden and Harris at the White House yesterday, and after Zelensky and Trump have exchanged some public criticism of each other in recent days while Zelensky has been here in the U.S. Now, Trump said after their meeting that he had, quote, learned a lot, but that he has not changed his stance that negotiations could bring an end to the war. Are we really at that point, Kelly, where this only ends with a negotiated settlement of some kind?
Oh, yes. I think we've been at that point for a very long time, that this will ultimately end in some kind of negotiated settlement. I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of wars do end that way. They do not end in outright victory for one side or the other. The real challenge, I think, right now is convincing both parties that they would be better off going to a negotiating table and settling the war rather than continuing to pursue it on the battlefield. And right now, certainly the Russians want to continue to pursue it on the battlefield. They're making gains in eastern Ukraine. They're obviously want to see who's going to win the next presidential election. And the Ukrainians, it seems, are also not ready to negotiate, although that one I think is a little harder to understand because their position is quite difficult. They're very overstretched, particularly with this offensive in Kursk. But I think ultimately, we're going to have to get to the negotiating table. And that's really, I think, the question we should be asking is, what is the plan to get there? That's one that has not been articulated by Ukraine or the Biden administration.
Well, in the meantime, Kelly, we know Ukraine has been making asks of the Biden administration to try to strengthen its position, including the desire for them to be able to use long-range weapon systems to target targets deeper in Russian territory. What actually changes about the state of this conflict if the Biden administration finally relents on that?
Yes. So, this is part of the so-called victory plan that Zelensky came to D.C. Or to visit Biden to discuss. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be much of a victory plan. It's, as you kind of pointed out, it's more of a shopping list. And one of those items is long-range strike permissions. I think the idea that the Ukrainians have is they'd like to be able to hit airfields, in particular where the Russians are launching fighter bombers that are carrying these glide bombs that have been used against their positions at the front. So that would be one of the key things. And they'd like to hit infrastructure, probably some energy infrastructure as well. The problem, though, I think with this is it might provide some tactical benefits, early on. But very quickly, the Russians are going to move these things. Russia's a large country. They'll move them back a couple hundred miles, and it won't really impact the battlefield or the course of the war in a very significant way, which I think is why the Biden administration has not provided these permissions, is that it doesn't have a huge impact potentially on the battlefield, but we have a very small supply of these kinds of long-range weapons, and we need them ourselves. And there are, of course, these significant escalation risks.
So it is, just quickly here, Kelly, it's in part a defense industrial base issue, too.
It's a defense industrial base issue, and it is an escalation issue. Putin announced a change to the nuclear policy, essentially saying that any non-nuclear country that strikes Russia, if they have assistance from a nuclear armed state, it is considered a joint attack. And that Russia could respond with nuclear weapons. And that's something that we have to still take very seriously. It's not a good sign anytime a country changes its official nuclear policy.
All right, Kelly, always great to have you. Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow with the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. Appreciate your time.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we've been keeping an eye on the Middle East today. As Israel says, it struck Hezbollah's headquarters in Lebanon as it continues its fight against the Iranian proxy. This is something that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talked about on the floor at the United Nations General Assembly in New York earlier today, just before we learned about this strike, saying that Israel has no choice but to continue.
As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, Israel has no choice, and Israel has every right to remove this threat and return our citizens to their homes safely. And that's exactly what we're doing.
Again, what they are doing appears to be going after Hezbollah headquarters. At least that's what they've said. And we've just learned within the last few moments that the Pentagon did not know in advance that Israel was going to conduct this operation. Sabrina Singh, a spokesperson at the Pentagon, briefing reporters, saying that the U.S. had no advance warning of Israel's attack in Lebanon, and that, in fact, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was speaking with Israel's Yoav Gallant when the attack was already underway. So for more on this, I'm pleased to say joining me here in our Washington, D.C. studio is Hagar Chemali. She is formerly of the National Security Council, where she was director for Syria and Lebanon, and is now founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies. Hagar, welcome back.
Kailey, good to see you in person.
It's great to see you as well, especially when we have news developing like this. Does it surprise you that Israel did not tell the U.S. what it was about to do when it is a strike that largely was seen or is being seen as an escalatory one?
It doesn't. First of all, if you look at similar assaults like this or attacks in Israel's history, they don't always give the U.S. a heads up when they've been targeting terrorist commanders and so on, things like that. They don't often, because these are very sensitive operations. Often they have to verify for sure that their target is in fact there. And then sometimes those decisions are made within minutes. Sometimes they take longer, but often minutes. But also on the U.S. side, they're worried for a leak. And if a leak happens, that target moves and they lose the opportunity the way they see it. And the U.S. operates no differently. When we targeted bin Laden, we certainly didn't give the Pakistanis a heads up that we were going into their territory on top of it. And so that did not surprise me at all.
Okay, well, fair enough. I wonder if it surprises you then that Netanyahu was saying, we have to keep going. We will continue to do this, even in the face of U.S. and other allies pushing for a 3-week ceasefire with Hezbollah. He is saying that Israel has no choice. To what extent is that true?
So, okay, well, a few things here. So first, his remarks don't surprise me. And part of it, one of the things, that I really think we need to notice is that over the last few months in particular, the Israeli government has really been, the Netanyahu government has been quite public and very clear on its intentions. And the international community, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, who are mediating a ceasefire, are still pushing for a ceasefire. And that is the noble and right thing to do. We should be pushing both sides to a ceasefire, even if we drag both sides to the table, kicking and screaming. But at the end of the day, both sides are also communicating very clearly that they're not ready, that they want to continue fighting. And even with what's happening in Lebanon now, very quickly the United States put forward a ceasefire proposal, and just as quickly as they put it down, the Israelis and Hezbollah shot it down. And so there is no appetite at the moment. On Israel's side, when it comes to Lebanon in particular, they view that the fact that the north of the country is completely empty undermines the integrity of their territory. And the problem with that is that they genuinely fear that Hezbollah is going to do an October 7 style incursion to go in, to invade, or to compromise that border. And it's also a reflection of the failure of the UN, because the UN is supposed to maintain the blue line between both and maintain that line as disarmed. And they clearly haven't been able to do that. And so that's Israel's view here. But the problem is, while they're saying, Hezbollah, you've been lobbing missiles at us nonstop, and we kept it kind of this secret understanding at a tit-for-tat level, and now we're done. You have to stop. We want to return our citizens to the north, and we can't have this land be empty. The problem are the assaults they're pursuing now, while it shows that Israel is not afraid of a full-scale escalation, it's just going to create another generation of people, and it's going to further undermine what is already a failed state in Lebanon and create a generation of people who are going to run to the arms of terrorism as a method. And that's my concern for Israel's long-term security. But I understand why it feels they need to approach Hezbollah through military action as well.
Well, and we should point out, Lebanese authorities say more than 700 people have been killed in strikes just over the course of the last week or so, 50 of them children. It does raise the question, though, Hagar, of what kind of retaliation you would expect from Hezbollah, who maybe doesn't have great incentive to escalate this conflict if they don't have to, but also if your headquarters have just been hit, you don't want to be seen as weak, right? Yes,
they've actually been seen as quite weak over the last few weeks in particular, because the tit for tat that's been going on for the last 11 months between Hezbollah and Israel seems to have actually genuinely weakened Hezbollah's leadership for sure. They've targeted apparently 500 commanders. Their communications, as we've seen, are all compromised, and now they feel they can't communicate with each other. And you also have weapons depots and so on that have been targeted. That doesn't mean that they don't have more operatives, that they don't have thousands more operatives, thousands more missiles, and that could cause a great destruction, of course. But we're seeing them struggle. The Iron Dome is intercepting many of the missiles, of course. Some of them are hitting. It's still not safe in the north of Israel. But Hezbollah is showing, in my opinion, a weakness automatically, and it makes me wonder if they're going to try to go back to the status quo, because Iran doesn't want to confront Israel directly. They want their proxies to do it.
Well, I was just going to ask about the role of Iran in this. Would Iran rather Hezbollah be perceived as weak but not actually have this escalating into a wider regional conflict, or do they want to have their proxies still be able to fight their fights for them, and therefore would be encouraging Hezbollah to do what it needs to do to showcase strength?
Yes, well, so it is absolutely in Iran's interest to have its proxies continue to attack Israel, continue to bother Israel and undermine Israel for sure, without Iran being roped in any way. Mm-hmm. And we saw that after Israel attacked Hamas's leader in Iran, Ismail Haniyeh, back over the summer. You saw Iran respond with a lot of bluster and promising to respond. Well, we haven't seen that response yet.
Nope.
And it was because ceasefire talks started to become very serious, because a ceasefire ultimately benefits Iran. Iran is weak right now. The regime is weak. Their people don't really want the regime. And so they know there's only so far they can go. And the threat of the U.S. getting involved if Israel is attacked by Iran is a deterrence that serves quite well in pushing back on Iran. But that's why they're happy having the Houthis attack, Hezbollah attack, Hamas attack. And Israel views this, it seems, as a war to fundamentally change things on the ground, like a 1967 war, like a 1973 war, not in terms of length. The length, I think, will be much longer. But this isn't anymore about punishing Hamas, defeating Hamas. This seems to be for them more about their existential, this threat to their existence, and that they want to fundamentally change how terrorists are operating on the ground and posing a threat to them.
Well, that does make me wonder about Israeli public sentiment, because we have seen domestic pressure on Netanyahu, especially as it pertains to Gaza, given the hostages that remain there, especially in the aftermath of the death of the 6 hostages that were executed by Hamas most recently. I wonder how sentiment factors into the conversation around the north and Lebanon, and if there may be more support domestically for what Israel is doing there than there may be in Gaza at this time. Domestically
in Israel, you mean?
Yeah.
I do believe there's more support.
And does it matter, frankly, at all to the Netanyahu government?
Well, what matters to the Netanyahu government, or Netanyahu himself, is that he wants to remain in power. And he knows that if he does it, he cuts a ceasefire deal, not on his terms, or even on his terms, his far-right cabinet members who are extreme could collapse his government. And then it will go into an election. He'll lose that election, and then he'll face corruption charges that he's going to face at some point, inevitably. And so there's on that side, domestically, you do have a very strong push for citizens to return to the north and to feel safe returning to the north. And so I don't see yet a pushback in Israel. It could change, though. It could shift. In Lebanon, nobody wants to invite a war. Nobody who doesn't support Hezbollah is excited about a war being invited into the country. But there is a deep understanding that Hezbollah is the one that invited this war for non-Hezbollah supporters, meaning Christians and Sunni for the larger part. But that doesn't mean that they also want Israel pursuing these attacks in Lebanon in general, even though they know that Hezbollah is the one launching these missiles in the north.
Finally, Hagar, as we consider the domestic pressure on Netanyahu and some of these other domestic pressures within all of these different countries, there also is great domestic pressure in the U.S. on this administration to get a ceasefire done in Gaza. We've heard from President Biden after announcing he would not seek re-election. One of the things he said he wanted to accomplish before leaving office is not just a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, but peace in the Middle East. It feels like we have gotten significantly farther away from that goal than we've gotten towards it. And I wonder if you think any of what he wants to accomplish is realistically going to get done before he leaves office in January.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't think any of it will get done. But unfortunately, when he said the part about the ceasefire, I do think that that at that time in the summer that he could believe that. I believed it. I said it on this show.
Yeah.
There were a lot of factors that seemed like a ceasefire was near. And I will say in history, in many Israeli peace negotiations, you've had U.S. officials that they still say the same thing. It's down to the 10%. It's down, as Secretary Blinken said, to the last 3 paragraphs of an 18-paragraph proposal, ceasefire negotiation. And even with that, many times negotiations have failed over not being able to agree on that last 10%. And the administration itself seems to have lost hope in the idea that a ceasefire is achievable by the election. Middle East peace, I don't think is achievable. I'm so sorry, but I don't think that's achievable for a while. Certainly not now. But no, I don't think that even they believe it's achievable at this point.
All right. Well, we have just had a headline cross the Bloomberg terminal that Biden has been briefed on these Beirut strikes by his national security team. Again, this is after the Pentagon said that the U.S. was not told in advance that these strikes were coming. Hagar, great to have you here in studio, especially as we're dealing with news like this. Hagar Chemali, of course, formerly of the National Security Council, now founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies. Enjoy the rest of your time in Washington. Appreciate you being here on Balance of Power, and especially the conversation around the proxies of Iran and Iran itself. We're going to continue talking about Iran in our next conversation as the U.S. Justice Department today unveiled charges against a number of Iranian operatives for allegedly carrying out the Iranian hack on Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign earlier this year. It claims these individuals gained access to internal documents of people working on the campaign, then shared that with journalists and officials working for what was then the Biden campaign. We're going to have more on this in an exclusive conversation coming up in just a moment with Lisa Monaco. She is the Deputy Attorney General of the United States. So stick with us for that. We'll have more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we are about to have a very important conversation as we are just weeks away from the 2024 presidential election. The Department of Justice this afternoon just announced new charges against multiple people for allegedly carrying out an Iranian-backed operation to hack the campaign of Donald Trump. That hack, remember, was first confirmed by the campaign last month. Security officials said Iran had sent the stolen material to people linked to what was then the Biden re-election campaign, journalists as well. And we want to have more on this and the wider efforts of foreign actors to interfere in the U.S. election, and turn for an exclusive interview to the U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, who is joining us now. Ma'am, thank you so much for being with us here on Bloomberg. This is an incredibly important conversation. If we could begin with just the charges that were unveiled today and these specific actors who have now been indicted, what do you know about the intentions of them? Is this part of a wider effort Iran is using to turn the tide against Donald Trump in this election?
Well, good afternoon, Kailey, and thanks very much for having me. What we've announced today are charges against 3 Iranian hackers who are engaging in a malign foreign influence campaign. The charges we have laid out today and announced today lay out a years-long hacking campaign targeting current and former government officials, targeting journalists, and most recently, targeting U.S. political campaigns. As you indicated, these charges include discussion and laying out of a malicious cyber activity that the intelligence community and the FBI has previously referenced. These efforts included malicious Iranian cyber actors sending unsolicited emails to individuals then associated with the campaign of President Biden, and those emails contained stolen excerpts of stolen non-public material from the Trump campaign. I should point out, Kailey, that there's no indication that the recipients replied to those emails. To your question about intent, the hackers made clear in their very own words, and we've laid this out in the charging document we unsealed today, and that intent is to undermine the campaign of former President Trump in advance of the election.
And I wonder, ma'am, how you see these efforts differing or working in tandem with the efforts of other adversaries, be it Russia or China, for example. Are they working in concert, or are they all working in different ways with similar motives?
Well, look, this is part of the charges we announced today and the broader aggressive activity that we are seeing from Iran, from Russia, from China, are part of a very complex, diverse, and aggressive foreign malign influence effort that we are seeing from our adversaries in this election cycle. So the charges we've announced today, I think, are consistent with what we have been seeing and warning about. The intelligence community has been quite clear over the last weeks and months about what we are seeing in the way of foreign malign influence. You have seen the Justice Department take aggressive action in the last several weeks. We unveiled the operations of Russian actors. In the last couple of weeks, we exposed Russian foreign malign influence campaigns, again, all directed at and in an effort to sow discord, to sow mistrust, and to undermine our confidence in our election process.
Well, of course, what you're alluding to, the seizure of dozens of domains that the DOJ is alleging have been propagating Russian-backed efforts to spread foreign malign influence, including around the presidential election. I believe there were some 32 of those domains. Ma'am, how far does that web go, and what else is Russia specifically doing? Are you seeing it having an impact?
That's exactly right, Kailey. What we exposed a few weeks ago were Putin-directed efforts using a Russian state-operated media arm, RT, to spread Russian propaganda, to spread pro-Russian narratives, using unwitting American commentators to do so, to funnel millions of dollars to a U.S. company in order to do that. And we also exposed the work of a proxy company, again, Putin-directed, called the Social Design Agency, which is a proxy company used by Russia to push out AI-generated content, again, pushing out Russian propaganda targeting U.S. voters and specific voter demographics, all in an effort to influence the election, to undermine confidence in our election process, to undermine also, from the Russians' perspective, to undermine our support for Ukraine. So this is part of a broader scheme and efforts, very aggressive efforts, by Russian foreign malign actors.
Again, we're in conversation here with the U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Obviously, ma'am, there are a number of channels and ways in which mis and disinformation that could be aimed at influencing voters can circulate in the modern age, including on social media, on platforms, for example, like X. Is the DOJ working with X and Elon Musk to try to tamp down on that mis and disinformation? And if you're trying, are you seeing cooperation on the other side?
Well, look, what we're doing is doing everything we can to investigate, to expose, and to disrupt these activities. When we see foreign malign influence activity on platforms across the United States, we are taking that information, using that information, and sharing it with platforms, including X. We are very focused on providing social media platforms information, actionable information in real time, so that they can take action under their own discretion, making their own judgments consistent with the First Amendment. We are providing them information, and then they are taking action at their own discretion to address that activity that we point out to them. So we will continue to do that. Our focus is on making sure we are exposing this activity so that Americans can be discerning consumers, because, Kailey, American voters should be deciding our election, not our foreign adversaries.
Well, on that point, ma'am, it's one thing to put out information, be it dis or misinformation, aimed at influencing American votes. It's another thing entirely to actually try to disrupt or tamper with the electoral process itself. To what extent is the Department of Justice concerned about potential cyber or even physical disruptions to the election process, be it on Election Day in November or in the early voting leading up to it?
So two things I would say on this, Kailey. One, we see our foreign adversaries trying to put into their malign influence campaigns disinformation and misinformation about the vulnerability of our voting systems. Our voting systems are quite resilient and they are quite diffuse, and they are by and large not connected, and almost a majority not connected to the internet. My colleagues at CISA over at DHS have the lead for the federal government in working to protect our critical infrastructure, and importantly, working with state and local officials to protect that infrastructure, that voting infrastructure. Remember, the voting in this country is controlled, owned, operated, and administered all at the state and local level. So our job in the federal government, working across the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, is to assist our state and local partners in that effort. We are sharing information about efforts to influence those that electoral process, but the election systems and the infrastructure themselves are very diffuse and very diffuse across the state and local jurisdictions and not connected to the internet. So people should be on the lookout for misinformation about that.
Madam Deputy Attorney General, I'd like to turn to another issue. As yesterday, the DOJ also charged 2 Russian nationals in a crypto laundering scheme. What can you tell us about how pervasive these potential laundering networks are, what their aims are, and how the DOJ is working in concert with other agencies like, say, the SEC in cracking down in this regard?
So you're quite right, Kailey. We took action yesterday to disrupt a number of malicious cyber criminals and to disrupt the criminal ecosystem that fuels their activity. 2 Russian nationals, and also we disrupted an illicit crypto exchange called Cryptix. This is part of our overall effort to disrupt wherever we can the criminal ecosystem that is fueling everything from ransomware to darknet drug trafficking to money laundering. And it was money laundering that was really at issue here. These are 2 Russian nationals engaged in a massive money laundering schemes that was fueling criminal activity across a whole spectrum of areas, as I said, ransomware and drug trafficking. What we are seeing is crypto, for instance, is the lifeblood of a lot of this illicit activity, including ransomware. And it may be advertised as borderless, but what we are showing, including with yesterday's charges that we brought, is that we will follow it wherever it goes, including to the darkest corners, and hold individuals to account.
Finally, ma'am, while we have you, I won't ask you to comment directly on the indictment of Eric Adams, but I do have a wider question for you about the perception and institutional trust in the Department of Justice. After that indictment came down, we heard from Donald Trump calling the Justice Department, quote, dirty players. I don't have to tell you he's argued consistently that the DOJ is being weaponized against him. Many of his supporters believe that largely to be true. How much harder is it for you to do your work when your credibility is being questioned by people at the highest levels of American politics?
I'm not going to comment on those attacks, Kailey, except to say that the men and women of the Justice Department are doing their job every single day without fear or favor, without regard to any political affiliation, following the facts wherever they lead. And yesterday's charges announced by the Southern District of New York, I think, reflect exactly that principle.
All right, we will leave it on that note. We sincerely appreciate your time, U.S. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, for an exclusive interview here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I've got some figures for you as well. Fresh data out of the swing states, thanks to Bloomberg's new polling with Morning Consult that finds Kamala Harris up 3 points against Donald Trump across the 7 battlegrounds that could ultimately decide this election. To run you through the headline figures, she's up 7 percentage points in Nevada. That is her widest lead. She leads by 5 in Pennsylvania, 3 in Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, up by 2 points in North Carolina. The only state in which she and Donald Trump are tied is in Georgia. But all of these figures are within the poll's margin of error. It's important to note. But what's also important to note is that these figures also suggest that the improvement she's seeing in the polls is coming simultaneously with improvement on the issue of the economy. So for more, let's turn to Eli Yokley. He is Morning Consult's U.S. politics analyst, joining me here on Bloomberg TV and radio, as he does every month when this poll comes out. Always good to see you. Eli, let's just start with the economy overall first, because this data is striking for us here at Bloomberg. Trump only up 4 percentage points on the economy overall. And when likely voters were asked who they trust more to handle the cost of everyday goods, it's a virtual tie. 47 Trump, 46 Harris. What has changed here?
Well, Kamala Harris is getting good marks on just about everything we're testing right now. And that's translating to how voters are perceiving her on the issues. I mean, we saw even improvements on issues like immigration. But look, when you dive into the economic issues, I mean, the cost of living, healthcare, and housing are the top 3 concerns for likely voters across the swing state map. And on all of those issues, she is making gains. She already had an advantage on healthcare. She's picked up an advantage on housing, and she's tied with Trump on the issue of costs. Voters are taking a look at her. It seems that some of her economic messaging is breaking through to them, and that's translating to a big growth in trust across a lot of these states.
Well, so let's think about how this breaks down state by state, because obviously she's looking at varying degrees of leads here or lack thereof. In Georgia, for example, where she's tied, is there a relationship between how voters in these states are viewing the economy and how well she is performing, or is it other issues depending on which state we're looking at?
I mean, this electorate is so partisan at this point. I think a lot of this is coming down to the kinds of voters who say they're likely to vote in November's election. I think that we're seeing in some of these other states more enthusiasm among Democratic voters. I think that in Georgia, perhaps it's a little less among Democrats. That's Donald Trump's big play here in the next few weeks, is whether he can change this likely voter sample that we're getting right now. That has been his political magic when he has won elections, is bringing in voters who do not say today that they're likely to vote. Right now, among these people who are excited about showing up at the polls, he is not performing that great. Across the swing states on the economy in particular, we have seen a bit of an improvement in how voters are perceiving their personal situation, the country's situation. That is something that I think, if it continues, seems to be something that would benefit Kamala Harris. But look, it's going to be a long few weeks as Donald Trump tries to win back some of these folks.
Yeah, well, I wonder how these results may have been changed by a Fed rate cut as well, or the expectation that it was happening. We know that borrowing costs could have a big impact in terms of how people are thinking about their own balance sheets and the cost of buying a home or what have you, right, Eli?
Yeah, I mean, that is a big deal. A lot of voters, about half of voters, I think, said that might have a positive impact on the economy. Kamala Harris has been out front on this housing issue in a way that President Biden really wasn't. I think voters, particularly in Nevada, are thirsty for answers on this issue as they face high housing costs there. She's taken plans to the electorate to deal with this issue in a way Donald Trump hadn't, and it appears that's resonating. She's doing very well in Nevada in a way Biden wasn't. Donald Trump is not competitive there currently. And some of this stuff seems to be breaking through to folks.
I also want to talk about the issue of immigration, because that's the one she's focused on today. She will be this afternoon traveling to Arizona, making a trip to the border, which, of course, Republicans have been critical of her not doing during her time as candidate and vice president as frequently as they believe that she should. On immigration, that does still appear to be a weakness for her in these states, Eli. A 14% lead enjoyed by Donald Trump on that issue. And it is a wide margin as well in states like Arizona and Nevada.
Yeah, I mean, since Joe Biden took office, even back when he was very popular at the beginning of his term, this immigration issue has weighed on him and the Democratic Party overall. I think what Kamala Harris is trying to do today is to go on the offense against Donald Trump and highlight the fact that he helped kill a bipartisan immigration bill in Congress this year. A lot of things that happen on Capitol Hill don't break through to the electorate a big way. And so it's incumbent on her to try to raise that to voters. I don't know how trusted she is on that issue right now, just given the posture voters have toward the Democratic Party. But addressing the issue, taking it head on, is something that could break through and help her with some of these remaining undecided voters.
Finally, Eli, as we consider the Sunbelt states, the border states or border adjacent states like Arizona are one thing. Then there's states like North Carolina, which have had their own kind of disruptive events, if you will, over the course of the last several weeks. When it comes to the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Mark Robinson, who of course was endorsed by Donald Trump, has faced allegations of making some pretty disturbing messages on a number of porn platforms, for example. Have we started to see that show up in the data? Do you think that has any role in the 2-point advantage Harris is currently enjoying in that state?
I don't think we saw much change month over month. I mean, this survey was conducted just after some of these revelations about Mark Robinson came down. In our surveys, we've seen it here at Morning Consult. He was already trailing Jeff Stein by double digits in that state. He was underperforming Donald Trump really, really significantly. The voters of North Carolina do not seem that interested in what he has to offer them. The question will be the amount of energy that folks put into that state now, though. Are Republicans going to write this off a bit? They probably shouldn't. It's a very important state for their chances. But, Democrats and Jeff Stein has a great opportunity here to try to lift up Kamala Harris with a campaign that's going to have a lot of energy among Democrats who see victory coming up in November.
All right, Eli Yokley, always great to have you. Morning Consult U.S. politics analyst. Thank you very much for joining me. Now, we want to turn back on these poll results to our signature political panel. Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist, alongside Jeanne Zaino, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Democratic strategist, both of them Bloomberg politics contributors. Rick, I'd like to begin with you, just given your deep knowledge of the state of Arizona. She is obviously going there today. This poll shows her leading Trump by 3 points within the margin of error. She's specifically going there to address the issue that she perhaps is weakest on, if our polls are to be believed: immigration. How capable of moving the needle on this issue will she be if she goes and goes to the border? Does it actually make a difference with 40 days to go until the election?
Well, I definitely think it makes a difference. This is the biggest hesitation about Kamala Harris that voters have, especially in the Sunbelt states, and doesn't rank as big an issue in the blue wall states. But if you want to compete in Georgia, in Arizona, and Nevada, in North Carolina, you have to have something to say about immigration. And she's been relatively quiet. I mean, she has been going heavy on economic issues, and then obviously starting to show in the polling data that you just discussed. But this is a chance for her to change the script a little bit. And she's got something to say. I mean, Donald Trump killed a bill that would have been a significant change in border policy for the first time in decades. That was supported actively by the Biden-Harris administration. So that'll be her talking point today. And if she can create some comfort that she isn't the raging liberal with open borders that Donald Trump has painted her as, then I think she will satisfy some of the questions that undecided voters might have about her. And she's not only showing up at the border, but she's also posting up a new border ad that'll help echo whatever happens today on the border.
So, Jeanne, I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, knowing that Harris, at the same time, she's tried to showcase that she has been a prosecutor. She repeatedly says that she's prosecuted transnational criminal organizations and targeted the flow of illegal substances and activity over the border. She has also talked about, and we saw her do this in an interview on MSNBC earlier this week, how she also supports creating more legal pathways to immigration. What is the appropriate balance for her here if she does want to draw in these independent voters, but also not alienate certain portions of her party?
Yeah, it's a tough act for her to walk, but I think you used exactly the right word, Kailey, and that is prosecutor. She has today got to prosecute Donald Trump for killing the bill and leaving us in the position where we are now. That's what she's got to say. We had a bill. We were pushing forward for change. It was bipartisan. The Wall Street Journal conservatives all described it as the toughest border security bill, and yet you killed it solely so you could run for president and have a chance of being elected. She's got to prosecute that case, and then she's got to make the case that this is part of her economic security care economy, that she is both tough on the border, tough on security, and she also recognizes that we have a society in which immigrants and migrants have played a critical role in making us who we are today, and we should be proud of them and welcome them when they come here legally, and she's going to ensure that happens. So she has a lot to say today. I think she should have been doing this earlier, but it's important she's doing it now because, as you were just mentioning, the Morning Consult poll, all polls show she is still behind on Donald Trump when it comes to this issue of the border in the minds of many voters.
But is gaining ground on him when it comes to the economy, which you were just alluding to, Jeanne, and Rick also mentioned. So I guess to some extent that does show us that her messaging and the policy ideas she has put forward are resonating. I just wonder, Jeanne, if you think we're starting to reach the point in the election cycle where economic feeling is going to be to a large degree already banked in, even if we have seen it change over the course of the last several months since Joe Biden was the candidate to now Harris. Things can only move so much from here, I would imagine, right?
That's true. And I think, Harris has done a good job, but I also think two other factors are important. Number one, the numbers and what has happened economically have worked in her favor. Consumer sentiment out that you were just talking about, that's to her favor. The Fed's decision September 18th, that's to her favor. So she's benefiting from a stronger economic numbers that people are feeling and seeing on the ground. And she's also benefiting, quite frankly, from the fact that Donald Trump simply seems not to be able to prosecute the case against her. He is out hawking commemorative coins when he should be making the case that she and Joe Biden have been bad for the economy and bad for security. So I think she's benefiting from those two things almost as much as she has from her ability to sell her plan and this care economy. And all of those things have allowed her to decrease the amount by which voters see him as good for the economy. Now, let's not forget, voters have something to lose. She's got to keep saying, do you want to take somebody who's threatening 60% tariffs? That's inflationary. That hurts our jobs. Don't let him do that, and don't let him risk what we've done as we've come so far. And people don't want to risk that. And so that's to her benefit as well.
So, Rick, what do you do if you're Donald Trump? Do you double down on economic attacks to try to stem the tide of her progress on this issue, or do you pivot to other areas of weakness more aggressively, like the border or something else?
Well, I would remind everybody that it was September 17th in 2008, in the middle of a winning campaign that John McCain was running against Barack Obama that changed the entire world's economic point of view when Lehman Brothers failed.
Fair point.
And completely upset the campaign. So I would not say it's too late for economics to play a significant role in this campaign. And unfortunately for Donald Trump, it seems to be headed in the opposite direction. Record week that Wall Street has had this week. These things add to the flavor of voters' views about Kamala Harris and her economy. It's not just the speeches and the ads that she's running. She has an environmental picture that seems to be helping her. That being said, the biggest hurdle I think that Donald Trump has right now is he's getting outspent 4-1 on TV in the targeted swing states. So when she says something, 4 times more people are hearing it than when Donald Trump says it. And we know Donald Trump is a master of earned media, but unless he can stay disciplined on the messages that he is talking about, he's going to get outshouted on all these issues by the Harris campaign. And so I know Republicans are particularly concerned about the fact that Donald Trump is getting drowned out. And the facts are that he is running out of time to prosecute this attack on Kamala Harris, whether it is on immigration or the economy or any other issue that is current in the news today. Donald Trump spent the whole day today getting, basically news around meeting with Zelensky on Ukraine, not an issue that is going to be particularly helpful to him. It's stunning to see Kamala Harris actually up by a point in our poll on commander-in-chief ratings. So right now is a bad cycle for Donald Trump.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our signature political panel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.